No one runs into the fire unless they have nothing left to lose. The flames rose in slow, roaring waves, nearly 50 feet high, casting a pulsing orange glow across the alien plaza as heat shimmered through the air like a living thing. And at the center of it stood Lyra Vena, bound by a field of crackling energy, her luminous blue skin reflecting the firelight like glass, her posture unbroken despite the weight of judgment pressing down from the silent crowd surrounding her, their tall silhouettes unmoving, their eyes fixed, their culture older than anything Ethan Cole had ever studied, and far less forgiving. The translator in his ear struggling to keep up with the ceremonial chants that rolled like thunder across the stone, words about purity, law, and consequence, words he didn't fully understand but felt anyway, deep in his chest, like something was wrong, deeply wrong, and Ethan wasn't supposed to be here. Just a contracted rescue technician passing through the outer systems, a man who fixed broken transports and patched up damaged hulls, not someone who interfered with alien rights, not someone who stepped into history that wasn't his. But then Lyra's eyes lifted, just slightly, catching the light, catching him, and for a fraction of a second everything else faded, the fire, the chanting, the distance between species, and all he saw was someone standing alone when they shouldn't have been, someone facing the end without anyone stepping forward, and that was enough. It was always enough, because Ethan had seen that look before, on battlefields, in wreckage, in quiet moments no one talked about, and every time he walked away, it stayed with him, heavier than any gear he carried. So this time, he didn't walk away. His boots hit the stone hard as he moved before his mind could argue, before logic could catch up, the heat hitting him in waves as alarms screamed from his suit, temperature warnings flashing red across his visor, but he kept going, pushing through the edge of the flame barrier, the air turning sharp and thin, every breath a fight, and the crowd shifted, not in panic, but in disbelief, their chants faltering as the humans stepped into something sacred, something forbidden, something irreversible. Ethan didn't look at them, didn't slow. He reached her, close enough now to see the fine fractures of light along her skin, close enough to feel the faint tremor in her stance. And for the first time, she looked uncertain, not afraid, not weak, just unsure, like the universe had broken its own rules. "Don't," she said, her voice low, strained, the translator catching it just enough. But Ethan shook his head, already moving, already lifting her carefully into his arms, the energy field flickering as if confused by the act itself. And for a heartbeat the fire seemed to hesitate, like it was watching too. And then everything roared back louder than before. But Ethan had already turned, already chosen, already carrying her out of something no one was meant to survive. And behind them, the silence of the crowd felt heavier than the flames. The night air hit them like a wall of cold steel, nearly 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And for a moment Ethan could not feel his hands anymore, only the weight of her against his chest, and the sharp hiss of his suit struggling to regulate the sudden drop in temperature as he stumbled away from the ceremonial ground, boots crunching over dark mineral dust that reflected faint traces of starlight, each breath loud inside his helmet, each step slower than the last. And still he did not stop, not even when the chanting behind him fell completely silent, replaced by something worse, a silence that felt like it was watching, judging, remembering. Lyra shifted slightly in his arms, her body lighter than he expected, but not fragile, never fragile, her skin still glowing faintly beneath the scorched edges, like embers that refused to die. And when her hand moved, just barely, it caught against the front of his suit, fingers curling as if testing whether he was real. Ethan glanced down, his visor flickering as it adjusted to the dim light, and for the first time he saw her up close without the distortion of fire, her features sharp, deliberate, alien in every way and yet unmistakably aware. "You should have left me," she said, her voice steadier now, though quieter, the translator catching every word with a half-second delay. Ethan exhaled slowly, a thin cloud of vapor forming inside the helmet. "Yeah," he replied, voice rough. "I hear that a lot." He kept moving, scanning the terrain ahead, his navigation system struggling to map the unfamiliar landscape. No clear structures, no immediate shelter, just jagged formations rising out of the ground like broken teeth, and a sky that felt too close, Too heavy. They will come, Lyra continued, her gaze drifting past him, not panicked, not pleading, just stating a fact the way someone describes gravity. What I was part of, what you interrupted, it was not just punishment, it was law. Ethan adjusted his grip slightly, careful not to cause her more discomfort. Then your law has a problem with me, he said, not looking back, not slowing down. The wind picking up now, carrying fine particles that tapped softly against his armor, like distant rain. Lyra studied him in silence for several seconds, her expression unreadable. Then, she spoke again, softer this time. You do not understand what you have done. Ethan let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. No, he admitted. But I understood enough. His steps finally slowed as he reached the edge of a shallow rock formation, a natural overhang that offered some protection from the wind. He crouched carefully, lowering her onto a relatively stable surface, his hands lingering for a second longer than necessary, making sure she would not slip, making sure she was steady. And when he pulled back, she did not look away, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made something in his chest tighten. On my world, she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. There is only one reason someone would carry another through fire. Ethan frowned slightly, the words unfamiliar, the meaning just out of reach, and for the first time since he ran into the flames. He hesitated, not from fear, not from doubt, but from the quiet sense that whatever came next was not going to be simple, not going to be something he could fix with tools or training. Lyra's hand moved again, resting lightly against the surface between them, not reaching for him, not pulling away either, just there, and the distance between them felt smaller than it should have been. And now, she continued, her voice steady despite the weight behind it, they will not see you as an outsider anymore. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze shifting toward the horizon where faint lights were beginning to form in the distance, moving, deliberate, approaching, and when he looked back at her, there was no accusation in her expression, no anger, only something else, something quieter, something he could not yet name. Then I guess, he said slowly, his voice calm despite the tightening pressure in the air. We are both in this now. The wind grew sharper as the distant lights multiplied, forming a slow, deliberate line across the horizon like stars that refused to stay in the sky. And Ethan felt it before he fully saw it. The shift in the air, the sense that something organized and inevitable was moving toward them. Not rushed, not chaotic, but certain. He adjusted the power levels on his suit, watching the energy reserves drop to 62%. Not critical yet, but not comforting either. And when he looked back at Lyra, she was already watching the lights, her expression calm in a way that made the situation feel heavier instead of lighter. They are not soldiers, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the cold that had begun to settle into her movements. They are witnesses. Ethan frowned slightly, his brow tightening. Witnesses to what? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer would not help. Lyra shifted her weight, pushing herself upright just enough to sit without his support, her posture still dignified despite the strain. To judgment, she replied, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the approaching figures. What you did cannot be undone, so it must be seen. Ethan let out a slow breath, glancing down at his hands for a moment, flexing his fingers as the suit compensated for the dropping temperature, then back at her. Where I come from, he said, voice low. We do not usually call a crowd just to decide what to do with someone. Lyra's gaze softened, just slightly, like something in his words had reached her in a way she had not expected. On my world, she answered. Decisions like this are never made in private. They belong to everyone. The wind carried another wave of cold air across the rocks, and Ethan stepped closer without thinking, positioning himself between her and the open terrain, not out of strategy, not out of calculation, just instinct. And she noticed, of course she noticed, her eyes flicking to his stance, to the quiet way he placed himself there, as if it were the most natural thing in the universe. You still do not understand, she said, softer now, standing there like that. Ethan gave a small, almost tired shrug. Maybe not, he admitted, but I know what it feels like when someone is about to face something alone. The lights were closer now, no longer distant points but defined shapes, tall figures moving in perfect formation, their movements synchronized, their presence controlled, not threatening in the way Ethan was used to, but heavier, like a decision already made long before they arrived. Lyra watched them approach, then looked back at him, and for the first time since he had pulled her from the fire, there was something different in her expression, not confusion, not resistance, but a quiet shift, like a wall beginning to crack. "Ethan Cole," she said, speaking his name carefully, as if testing it. "If they ask you to leave, you should." Ethan shook his head almost immediately. Not dramatic, not defiant, just certain. "That is not really my style," he said, and something in that answer made her pause, her fingers tightening slightly against the stone beside her, not from fear, but from something else, something closer to realization. The first of the figures reached the edge of the rock formation, stopping just beyond the natural boundary, not crossing it, not yet, and the rest aligned behind them in perfect silence, dozens of glowing eyes fixed on the two of them, the air between both sides holding attention that did not need words. And in that stillness, Lyra leaned just slightly toward Ethan, her voice barely audible. "If they speak the words," she whispered, "everything changes." Ethan did not look away from the approaching line, but his voice answered her all the same, calm and grounded in a way that felt almost out of place in that moment. "Then we will deal with it when it happens." And for the first time, Lyra did not argue. She simply watched him, as if trying to understand how someone could stand in front of something so absolute and still choose not to step back. The first of them stepped forward without a sound, stopping exactly 10 feet from the edge of the rock, as if an invisible line had been drawn long before Ethan arrived, its height easily over 7 feet, its form wrapped in layered, reflective material that caught the faint starlight and bent it into shifting patterns. And when it spoke, the voice did not come from a mouth, but from the air itself, resonating low and clear. The rite was interrupted. The translator struggled for half a second before aligning the meaning, and the words settled over the space like a weight that could not be ignored. Ethan did not move, his stance steady, his eyes fixed on the figure, not challenging, not yielding, just present. Lyra remained seated behind him, but her posture had changed, straighter now, more alert, as if every part of her understood what this moment carried. "The human acted without knowledge," the voice continued, not accusing, not forgiving, simply stating, and several of the figures behind it shifted in perfect synchronization, their attention never leaving Ethan. "Then maybe it is time someone explains it." Ethan replied, his voice calm, carrying just enough to be heard without force, the wind pulling at his jacket as he spoke, the suit systems humming softly in response to the dropping temperature. There was a pause, not hesitation, but consideration. As if the idea itself required processing, Lyra's eyes moved between them, watching closely, measuring every word, every breath. "On this world," the voice said at last, "fire is not destruction, it is declaration." The faint glow from their forms pulsed once, subtle but deliberate. To carry another through it is to claim responsibility beyond life, beyond status, beyond choice. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, not regret, just the quiet realization that this was not a misunderstanding that could be corrected with a simple explanation. "That was not my intention," he said, not defensive, just honest. The wind shifting again, colder now, sharper, the distant stars dimming behind a thin layer of moving cloud. "Intention does not alter meaning." The voice responded, steady and unchanging, and behind Ethan, Lyra's fingers pressed slightly into the stone, her gaze lowering for a brief moment before lifting again, stronger. This time, "Then what happens now?" Ethan asked, his tone unchanged, the question simple even if the answer would not be. The figures did not move closer, did not raise any sign of threat, but the air itself seemed to hold its breath. "Now," the voice said, "the bond must be acknowledged or denied." The words hung there, precise and final, and Ethan turned his head slightly, just enough to glance back at Lyra, not fully, not breaking his stance, but enough to meet her eyes, and in that look, there was no pressure, no demand, just a quiet question. Lyra held his gaze, her luminous blue skin reflecting the faint light, as if something inside her had begun to shift, slowly, steadily. "If it is denied," she said, her voice carrying forward before the figures could continue. Then he becomes an offender against our law. Her tone did not waver, but there was something beneath it now, something personal, something that had not been there before. Ethan turned his attention back to the figure. And if it is acknowledged, he asked, the wind rising again around them, the cold pressing harder against the edges of his suit. The figure's glow pulsed once more, slightly brighter this time. Then he is no longer an outsider. It answered, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in the formation behind it, not movement, but awareness, as if the meaning of that statement carried more than just status. Ethan stood there, between two outcomes that were not his to define, his breath steady, his posture unchanged, and behind him, Lyra slowly rose to her feet, despite the strain, despite the cold, her presence aligning with his in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like choice. And when she spoke again, her voice was no longer uncertain, no longer distant, but clear, measured, and heard by all. Then the question is not what he has done, she said, her gaze fixed forward, but what I am willing to accept. The air seemed to still around her words, as if the entire horizon leaned in to listen, and Ethan felt it. That shift that had nothing to do with temperature or wind, something deeper, something that belonged entirely to her world. Lyra stood fully now, her balance not perfect but unyielding, her shoulders squared despite the strain, the faint glow of her skin steadying as if responding to a decision forming inside her. And the figures across from them did not interrupt, did not rush, they simply waited, because whatever came next was not theirs to decide. It was hers. Ethan remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, his presence quiet but anchored, like a line drawn in place without force. He did not look at her this time, did not try to read her expression, because something told him this was not a moment to influence, only to witness. Lyra's gaze moved slowly across the line of observers, taking them in one by one, their stillness, their expectation, the weight of a culture that had already decided what this moment meant long before either of them arrived. And for a brief second, something flickered across her face, not fear, not doubt, but memory, something older than this night, older than the fire, something tied to who she had been before all of this. I was not meant to stand here, she said at last, her voice carrying clearly across the open space, steady and controlled. I was meant to be an example. The wind shifted again, brushing against her hair, lifting it slightly before letting it fall, and the figures did not react, but their attention sharpened. An example of what happens when someone no longer fits within the structure that defines us, she continued, her tone unchanged, but the meaning beneath it growing heavier with each word. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, not in disagreement, but in understanding. The kind that came without needing explanation. Lyra turned her head, just enough to look at him, and in that brief glance, something passed between them, not a promise, not an agreement, just recognition. And when she faced forward again, her voice was different, not louder, but clearer, more certain. But he did not see that, she said, and this time there was no distance in her words, no separation. He did not see a law, or a sentence, or a ritual. Her hand lifted slightly, not pointing, not reaching, just acknowledging. He saw someone standing alone. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air, and for a moment the world felt smaller, quieter, as if everything else had stepped aside. The leading figure remained still, but its glow shifted subtly, responding, listening. You speak as if intention holds weight. The voice said, not dismissive, but questioning. Lyra did not hesitate. It does, she answered, without raising her tone, without breaking her stance. Because without it, law becomes distance, and distance becomes silence. The words settled between them, and even Ethan could feel it. The way they did not challenge the structure directly, but bent it, just slightly, just enough to make space for something else. The wind slowed, the cold less biting for a moment, as if even the environment paused to hear the outcome. Then you understand the consequence. The voice replied, measured and precise, and Lyra's expression did not change. But something in her posture did, something that looked less like resistance and more like acceptance. I do, she said, her gaze steady, her voice unwavering. and I accept it. A ripple moved through the line of observers, subtle but unmistakable, like a current passing through still water, and Ethan felt it in his chest. The shift from uncertainty to something else, something final, something chosen. Lyra took a small step forward, closing the space between her and Ethan by just a few inches. Not enough to touch, but enough to remove any doubt about where she stood. He carried me through the fire, she said, her voice softer now, but no less clear. Not as a claim, not as a right, but as a choice. She paused, just for a second, just enough for the silence to deepen. So, I will answer with one of my own. And for the first time, the outcome was no longer something waiting to happen. It was something already unfolding. The silence that followed her words was not empty. It was full, dense, like something ancient had just shifted its weight, and Ethan felt it in the way the air pressed differently against his chest, in the way the figures across from them no longer seemed like distant observers, but part of something larger that had just been set into motion. Lyra stood beside him now, not behind, not separate. Her presence aligned with his in a way that felt intentional, deliberate, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a clarity that cut through the cold like light. I acknowledge the bond, she said, each word measured, each syllable steady, and the moment those words left her lips, the glow from the figures intensified just slightly, not brighter in a threatening way, but deeper, as if responding to a signal older than either of them could understand. Ethan did not move, but something inside him did, something quiet and unfamiliar. Not fear, not hesitation, but the awareness that this was no longer just about getting out safely. This was something that would follow him long after this night ended. The leading figure inclined its form forward by a fraction, a gesture that felt less like authority and more like recognition. Then it is witnessed, the voice said, calm and absolute, and behind it, the formation shifted in unison, not stepping closer, not retreating, but settling. As if a decision had been placed exactly where it belonged, Lyra exhaled slowly, a breath she had been holding since before the fire, and for a moment her shoulders lowered just slightly, not in weakness, but in release, and when she turned her head toward Ethan, there was no uncertainty left in her expression, only something quieter, something steadier. You should understand what this means, she said, her voice no longer distant, no longer guarded. Ethan let out a small breath, the edge of a tired smile touching his lips despite everything. I have a feeling I am about to, he replied, and that earned the faintest shift in her gaze, not quite amusement, but close enough to feel real. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying less bite, as if the world itself had decided to ease its grip. You are no longer separate from this, Lyra continued, her eyes holding his. Not by law, not by perception, not by consequence. Ethan glanced past her for a second, taking in the line of figures, the way they now regarded him, not as an intruder, not as a problem to be resolved, but as something else entirely, something defined by her choice. And when he looked back at her, there was no regret in his expression, no attempt to undo what had already been done. I was not planning on being separate, he said quietly, and the simplicity of that answer lingered between them, heavier than any formal declaration. The leading figure spoke again, its voice carrying the same calm authority as before. The bond is acknowledged, but it is not yet complete. Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, the first hint of confusion breaking through his steady demeanor. There is more, he asked, not skeptical, just trying to understand the rules he had stepped into. Lyra did not look away this time, did not hesitate. There is always more, she said softly, and for a moment the space between them felt smaller than it should have been, not because of proximity, but because of something unspoken settling into place. The figure's glow pulsed once, steady and deliberate. The rite was interrupted. It continued, and so it must be fulfilled in another way. Ethan felt the weight of those words immediately, not as a threat, not as pressure, but as inevitability, like gravity taking hold. What does that involve? He asked, his voice calm, but more focused now. And for the first time since they had emerged from the flames, Lyra's gaze shifted slightly, not away from him, but inward, as if searching for the right way to say something that could not be made simple. It means, she said slowly, Her voice quieter now, but no less steady. That what began in fire must be chosen again without it. And in that moment, the night did not feel colder. It felt closer, like everything ahead had just stepped within reach. The words settled between them like a quiet line drawn in the dark, and Ethan felt it. The shift from something that had already happened to something that still required a choice. Not forced, not dictated, but real in a way that made everything else fall away. The wind slowed again. The cold no longer biting but present, like a reminder that this was still a world that did not belong to him. Lyra stood beside him, her posture steady despite everything she had endured, her glow no longer flickering but constant, as if the decision she had made had anchored something deep within her. And yet when she looked at him now, there was a question there, not spoken, not demanded, but waiting. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the air, his eyes moving from her to the figures and back again, taking in the stillness, the expectation, the strange calm that followed something irreversible. "So this is the part where I am supposed to understand everything," he said quietly, not as a joke, not quite serious either, just a way to give shape to the moment. Lyra's gaze softened just slightly. "No," she replied, her voice steady. "This is the part where you decide if you want to." The simplicity of that answer lingered longer than any explanation could have, and Ethan let it sit, turning it over in his mind not as a problem to solve, but as something to feel, something that did not come with instructions or guarantees. He glanced down at his hands for a moment, the suit still humming softly, systems stable, everything mechanical working exactly as it should, and yet none of that mattered here, not really, because this was not about systems or outcomes. It was about a moment that would not repeat itself. "Where I come from," he said slowly, lifting his gaze back to hers. "People make choices like this all the time without realizing it." Lyra tilted her head slightly, listening, not interrupting. "They step in when they do not have to," he continued, his voice calm, grounded. "They stay when it would be easier to leave." His eyes held hers now, steady, unguarded. "And most of the time, they do not call it anything." The wind brushed lightly across them, carrying a faint warmth from somewhere far behind, a distant reminder of the fire that had started all of this. "But here," he added, a faint breath of something like understanding in his tone, "it means something more." Lyra did not look away, her expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but open in a way that felt both new and certain. "Here," she said softly, "it means everything." The figures remained silent, their presence unchanged, but the space between all of them felt different now, less like a boundary and more like a threshold, something waiting to be crossed. Ethan took a small step forward, not toward the figures, not away from them, but closer to Lyra, closing the last inch of distance that had remained between them, his movement slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to step back if she chose to. But she did not. She held her ground, her gaze steady, her presence unwavering, and in that stillness, the question that had been building since the fire did not need to be spoken. It was already there, already. "Understood." Ethan let out a quiet breath, the tension in his shoulders easing not because the situation had become simpler, but because he had stopped trying to make it simple. "Then I choose it," he said, his voice low but clear, and the moment those words left him, something shifted again, not in the figures, not in the air, but in the space between them. Something that felt less like a bond being formed and more like one being recognized. Lyra's eyes held his for a second longer, and then she nodded, once, small but certain, as if confirming something that had already taken root, and behind them, the night remained still, waiting, not for what had already been decided, but for what would come next. The moment his words settled into the air, the silence did not break. It deepened, as if something unseen had been waiting for that exact answer, and Ethan felt it again, that quiet shift, not outside but within, like a door he had not known existed had just opened without sound. Lyra did not move at first, her gaze still locked with his, searching, confirming. And then something in her expression softened in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, not weakness, not surrender, but recognition, as if the distance she had carried her entire life had finally met something that did not push back. The leading figure stepped forward exactly one pace, No more, no less. Stopping again at that invisible boundary, its glow steady, deliberate. Then it is completed. The voice said, calm and final, and behind it, the formation shifted in perfect unison, not advancing, not retreating, but aligning, as if the entire structure of their presence had just reorganized around a new center. Ethan did not step back, did not react with surprise, but he felt the weight of that statement settle into him, not as pressure, but as something that would remain, something that would not fade when the night ended. Lyra inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling with a steadiness that had not been there before, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a tone that was no longer guarded, no longer shaped by resistance. Then it is witnessed by all, she said, and for the first time, the figures responded not with silence, but with a low resonance that passed through the air like a distant chord, not loud, not overwhelming, but undeniable, a sound that seemed to acknowledge rather than judge. Ethan glanced briefly toward them, then back to her, his brow easing slightly, as if some part of him had expected something harsher, something more difficult. But instead there was only this quiet confirmation that what had happened was now part of something larger. That is it, he asked, his voice calm but edged with a faint disbelief. Lyra almost smiled, not fully, not openly, but enough to be seen. For them, she answered, her eyes holding his. Yes. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying a faint warmth that did not belong to the night. And for a moment, everything felt suspended, as if the world had paused to let the meaning settle into place. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since the fire, and he let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding. And for us, he asked quietly, the question not demanding, not uncertain, just honest. Lyra did not answer immediately, her gaze drifting for a second toward the horizon where the first hints of distant light were beginning to change, not brighter, but different, as if the night itself was preparing to move on. And when she looked back at him, there was something new in her eyes, something that had not been there when they first met, something that did not belong to law or ritual or expectation. For us, she said slowly, her voice softer now. It begins. The simplicity of that answer settled deeper than anything else that had been spoken, because it did not define what came next. It did not limit it. It only opened it, and Ethan felt that too. Not as certainty, but as possibility, something wide and unstructured and real. He gave a small nod, not because he fully understood, but because he did not need to anymore. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them no longer heavy, no longer uncertain, but steady, like something that had found its place. Behind them, the formation began to withdraw, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same measured precision they had arrived with, their presence fading into the distance without a single backward glance, leaving only the two of them at the edge of something new. And as the last of the lights disappeared into the horizon, the night did not feel empty. It felt different, as if it had made room for something that had not existed before, something neither of them had planned, but both had chosen. And for the first time since the flames rose into the sky, Ethan did not feel like he was standing in someone else's world. He felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The night settled into a quiet that no longer felt like waiting. And for the first time since he stepped onto this world, Ethan let his shoulders drop without expecting something to rise against him. The cold still there, but no longer biting, just present, like everything else that had chosen to remain. Lyra stood beside him, her posture no longer shaped by resistance or survival, but by something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself anymore. And when she moved, it was not to create distance, but to close it, her steps slow but certain as she came to stand fully at his side, not behind him, not separate. And for a moment neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because words would have made it smaller than it was. Ethan looked out toward the horizon where the last of the distant lights had disappeared, the sky above them stretching wide and unfamiliar, and yet not as distant as it had felt before. So, he said quietly after a while, his voice carrying easily in the still air, what happens now? Lyra followed his gaze for a moment before answering, her eyes reflecting faint traces of starlight that seemed less cold than before. Now, she said, her voice calm. We walk forward. The simplicity of it almost made him smile, and he glanced at her, a faint breath of something lighter in his expression. That sounds a lot like a plan without a plan, he said. And this time, she did smile. Just slightly. Just enough to change the way the light touched her features. It is, she replied. But it is ours, the words settled. Between them with more weight than anything that had been declared earlier. Not because it was louder, but because it was chosen. Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze dropping briefly to the ground before lifting again, as if marking the point where everything had shifted, and when he looked back at her, there was no hesitation left, only a quiet acceptance of whatever this path would become. Where I come from, he said, his voice steady. People usually want to know exactly where they are. Going before they take the first step. Lyra tilted her head slightly, considering that. And do they always get there? She asked, not challenging, just curious. Ethan shook his head once, a small motion. Not really, he admitted, and something in that answer seemed to settle into her, not as doubt, but as understanding, the kind that did not need to be explained. The wind moved again, softer than before, carrying with it a faint warmth that felt almost like the memory of fire, but without its intensity, without its demand, just a quiet reminder of where this had begun. Lyra took another step forward, then paused, turning her head slightly toward him, not fully, just enough. Then perhaps, she said softly, this is where we are meant to begin. Ethan looked at her for a second longer than necessary, not searching, not questioning, just taking in the way she stood there, no longer defined by the world that had nearly taken her, but by the choice she had made to stand here now, with him, and something in that felt simple in a way that everything else had not. He gave a small nod, not dramatic, not symbolic, just real, and stepped forward beside her, their movements aligning without effort, without instruction, and as they began to walk, the ground beneath them no longer felt like a boundary or a place of judgment. It felt like something open, something waiting, the stars above steady and distant, but not unreachable. And for a moment, Ethan allowed himself to stop thinking about what this meant in the long term, about the consequences or the definitions or the names that might come later, because none of that mattered right now, not in this step, not in this quiet beginning. Lyra walked beside him without looking back, without hesitation, her presence no longer carrying the weight of expectation, but something lighter, something chosen, and in that silence, in that shared motion forward, there was no need for ceremony or confirmation, because what had been decided did not need to be repeated, it only needed to be lived. And as the night stretched out ahead of them, no longer cold, no longer distant, just vast and open, the only thing that remained was the quiet understanding that neither of them had been looking for this, neither of them had planned it. And yet somehow, in a world ruled by laws older than memory, the simplest thing had changed everything. He did not save her to belong to her, and she did not choose him because she had to, but somewhere between fire and silence, between instinct and choice, they had both stepped into something neither of them could have named. And for the first time, they did not need to.